Chapter 1 Prologue and Introduction. The South Atlantic Ocean is one of the most remote and unforgiving regions on Earth. Vast stretches of icy water extend endlessly toward the horizon, whipped by powerful winds that sweep north from Antarctica. Storms roll across these seas with little warning, and the cold penetrates even the thickest layers of clothing. For centuries, sailors dreaded this part of the ocean, calling it one of the most treacherous places to navigate. Yet, in the middle of this hostile environment lies a small cluster of islands that would become the focal point of one of the last major conflicts of the 20th century. These are the Falkland Islands, or, as they are known in Spanish, Las Islas Malvinas. At first glance, the islands appear unremarkable. They cover a modest area, roughly the size of the U.S. state of Connecticut, or slightly smaller than Northern Ireland. Two large islands, East Falkland and West Falkland, dominate the archipelago, while hundreds of smaller islands dot the surrounding seas. The landscape is windswept and rugged, shaped by glaciers in ancient times. Rolling hills rise into sharp ridges, while long valleys stretch toward the coastline. Trees are almost absent, leaving only open grasslands where sheep graze. The human population, even in modern times, numbers only a few thousand, mostly clustered around the capital, Port Stanley, a small town of brightly painted houses that overlook the harbor. To the casual observer, these islands may seem like a quiet, forgotten corner of the world. But history has shown that geography often hides deeper significance. The Falklands sit strategically in the South Atlantic, roughly 300 miles off the coast of Argentina and nearly 8,000 miles from Britain. They command important sea routes, provide access to rich fishing waters, and may hold valuable oil and gas reserves beneath the surrounding seabed. For nations competing for influence, these islands represent far more than just land and sheep pastures. They are symbols of sovereignty, pride, and power. In 1982, the Falklands would become the scene of a 10-week war that captured global headlines. It was a war fought between two nations separated by an ocean but united by a bitter territorial dispute. Argentina, ruled at the time by a repressive military junta, and the United Kingdom, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. For Argentina, reclaiming the Malvinas was seen as a matter of national dignity, a chance to erase what they considered centuries of colonial injustice. For Britain, defending the Falklands was about standing firm against aggression, protecting the rights of its citizens, and proving that even in the late 20th century, a distant overseas territory could still command national commitment. The Falklands War was short in duration but immense in impact. It lasted just 74 days, from April to June of 1982. In that time, over 900 soldiers, sailors, and airmen would lose their lives. Warships would sink beneath the freezing waters of the South Atlantic. Fighter jets would clash in deadly dogfights. Soldiers would fight brutal battles across desolate hills, in conditions as harsh as any battlefield of the modern era. And in the end, the war would reshape politics in both Britain and Argentina, leaving behind a legacy that still influences their relationship today. Yet, this story is not just about military campaigns or political leaders. It is also about the people who lived through it. For the islanders themselves, farmers, shopkeepers, and families who had called the Falklands home for generations, the war was not a matter of maps and treaties, but of survival. For young Argentine conscripts, many of them poorly trained and ill-equipped, it was a sudden plunge into the horrors of combat. For British servicemen, it was a distant war fought far from home, in conditions that tested their endurance and spirit. To understand how such a war came to be fought over such remote islands, we must go back in time. The Falklands dispute did not begin in 1982. Its roots stretch back centuries, to the age of exploration, when European empires scoured the globe in search of new territories. From the first recorded sightings of the islands in the 16th century, to rival settlements established by France, Spain, and Britain, to Argentina's own claims after gaining independence from Spain, the question of who truly owned the Falklands has remained contested. This is not just the story of a war, it is the story of a dispute born out of history, shaped by empire, and fueled by nationalism. A dispute that simmered for decades and finally erupted into violence. This is the story of the Falklands War, its origins, its battles, its consequences, and its enduring legacy. Chapter 2: Colonial Roots and the Dispute. To understand the war that erupted in 1982, we must step back in time, long before Britain and Argentina faced one another across the cold seas of the South Atlantic. The origins of the Falklands dispute are found in the Age of Exploration, a period when European powers sailed across uncharted oceans, claiming distant lands in the name of empire. The Falklands, remote, windswept, and uninhabited, became part of this global competition. The first recorded sighting of the islands is a matter of debate. Some historians credit the English navigator John Davis, who in 1592 may have glimpsed the islands while sailing through the South Atlantic. Others argue that Dutch seafarers were the first to record their existence, or that Spanish explorers had already passed nearby. What is certain is that the islands entered European maps in the late 16th century, their barren coastlines attracting little attention at first. By the 18th century, however, the Falklands began to draw interest. France established the first known settlement in 1764 on East Falkland, naming it Port Louis. Just 1 year later, unaware of the French presence, the British arrived and built their own outpost at Port Egmont on West Falkland. Within 2 years, two rival European powers were staring at each other across the islands. France eventually ceded its claim to Spain, leaving Britain and Spain to quarrel over sovereignty. Spain argued that, as the inheritor of vast South American territories under the Treaty of Tordesillas, it had the right to control the Falklands. Britain countered with its own claim, based on discovery and settlement. Tensions flared, and in 1770, Spanish forces expelled the British from Port Egmont. A crisis loomed, nearly dragging Europe into war. But diplomacy prevailed. The British were allowed to return the following year, though the sovereignty question remained unresolved. By 1774, Britain withdrew from the settlement due to cost-cutting measures, leaving behind a plaque asserting its claim to the islands. Spain remained in control, administering the Falklands from Buenos Aires. Yet even Spain's hold was tenuous. The islands were distant, expensive to maintain, and of little practical value to an empire already stretched thin across the globe. When Argentina declared independence from Spain in 1816, it considered itself the rightful heir to all Spanish territories in the region, including the Malvinas. In 1820, an Argentine naval officer, David Jewett, raised the flag of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata over the islands, formally claiming them in Argentina's name. Over the next decade, Argentine authorities attempted to establish settlements and regulate fishing rights in the surrounding waters. But the young nation's control was fragile. In 1831, after a dispute over sealing rights, the United States destroyed the Argentine settlement at Puerto Soledad. And in 1833, Britain reasserted its claim. A British naval expedition arrived, expelled the small Argentine garrison, and established permanent British administration over the islands. This moment became the central grievance in Argentina's long struggle for sovereignty over the Malvinas. To Argentines, 1833 marked a blatant act of colonial theft, an injustice that demanded correction. To the British, it was a simple reoccupation of land they had never abandoned in principle. Throughout the 19th century, the Falklands became increasingly British in character. Settlers arrived, sheep farming took root, and Port Stanley grew into a small but vital port for ships rounding Cape Horn. Argentina, meanwhile, never accepted British control. Successive governments continued to protest, though they lacked the power to enforce their claim. The 20th century brought new dynamics. After World War II, the global tide turned against colonialism. Dozens of territories across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean achieved independence. Argentina saw this as an opportunity. If colonial empires were dissolving, why not the British presence in the Malvinas? Beginning in the 1940s and 1950s, Argentina pressed its case more forcefully in international forums, bringing the dispute before the newly formed United Nations. In 1965, the UN passed Resolution 2065, acknowledging the sovereignty dispute between Britain and Argentina and calling for negotiations to find a peaceful solution. For Argentina, this was a victory, a recognition that its claim had legitimacy. For Britain, it was more complicated. While open to talks, British leaders faced the reality that the Falkland Islanders overwhelmingly wished to remain under British rule. Indeed, this question of self-determination became central. The Falkland Islanders, many of whom traced their ancestry to Britain for generations, felt little connection to Argentina. They spoke English, lived by British traditions, and considered themselves subjects of the crown. For them, Argentina's claim seemed distant and unwelcome. Still, talks continued through the 1960s and 1970s. At times, proposals were floated for shared sovereignty, leaseback arrangements, or gradual transfers. Yet none of these found acceptance, largely because of the islanders' resistance. By the late 1970s, negotiations had stalled. Argentina's frustration grew, and Britain's commitment to defend the islands seemed uncertain. This long history of rivalry, stretching back centuries, created a tinderbox. Each side clung fiercely to its narrative, Argentina viewing the islands as stolen territory awaiting liberation, Britain insisting on the principle of self-determination for its people. The stage was set, and it would not be long before political circumstances in both Buenos Aires and London would push this dispute from diplomatic arguments into armed conflict. Chapter 3: The Road to War. By the late 20th century, the Falkland Islands had become a quiet but stubborn reminder of unfinished colonial business. For decades, the sovereignty dispute remained unresolved. Argentina insisted the Malvinas were rightfully theirs, Britain insisted the islanders had the right to decide their future. But disputes alone do not start wars. Wars erupt when political pressures, national pride, and miscalculations collide. In the early 1980s, those forces came together with explosive consequences. The backdrop was one of political crisis, on both sides of the Atlantic. Argentina in crisis. Since 1976, Argentina had been ruled by a military junta, a repressive regime led by the armed forces. The junta had seized power in a coup, promising to restore stability and order after years of economic turmoil and political violence. Instead, it unleashed what became known as the Dirty War, a campaign of state terror against political opponents, dissidents, and suspected left-wing activists. Thousands of Argentines were disappeared, abducted and killed by the regime. Fear and repression hung over daily life. By the early 1980s, the junta was losing its grip. The economy was in freefall, plagued by hyperinflation, debt, and unemployment. Protests grew bolder, and the regime's brutality was increasingly condemned abroad. General Leopoldo Galtieri, who became president in December 1981, faced a desperate situation. His popularity was collapsing, and Argentina teetered on the edge of unrest. For the junta, the Malvinas offered a lifeline. The islands were a cause that united Argentines across political and social divides. The recovery of the Malvinas had long been framed as a sacred national mission, a matter of dignity and sovereignty. By launching a bold move to reclaim them, Galtieri and his fellow generals believed they could rally the nation, distract from domestic failures, and restore their legitimacy. Britain in decline. Across the ocean, Britain faced its own troubles. The once great empire was a shadow of its former self. In the decades after World War II, Britain had decolonized much of Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Its global role was shrinking, and many questioned whether faraway territories like the Falklands were worth defending. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. Her government faced deep economic recession, industrial unrest, and rising unemployment. Thatcher's popularity plummeted. Some within her own party doubted her survival as leader. In this climate, the Falklands seemed a minor concern. Indeed, a series of decisions by Britain in the late 1970s and early 1980s appeared to signal declining commitment to the islands. In 1981, the British government announced plans to withdraw HMS Endurance, the Royal Navy's Antarctic patrol vessel. The ship was the only visible military presence near the Falklands. Its removal sent a message, at least in Argentine eyes, that Britain was not serious about defending the islands. At the same time, budget cuts reduced the Royal Navy's size and capability. Diplomats in Buenos Aires reported that Argentina was growing bolder, sensing weakness. Failed diplomacy. Throughout the 1970s, negotiations between Britain and Argentina had continued in fits and starts. Proposals included joint administration and even a leaseback arrangement, where sovereignty would formally pass to Argentina but Britain would lease the islands back for 99 years. But these ideas collapsed under pressure from the islanders themselves, who rejected any move toward Argentina. By 1981, talks had stalled completely. Argentina grew frustrated, convinced that Britain would never negotiate seriously. The junta began to view force as the only option. In secret, plans were drawn for a military operation to seize the islands quickly and present the world with a fait accompli. Miscalculations on both sides. The stage was set for war, but neither side fully understood the other's resolve. The Argentine junta believed Britain would not fight. To them, the islands were a distant possession, thousands of miles away, defended only by a handful of Royal Marines. They assumed that London, facing domestic problems and military cutbacks, would ultimately accept the loss rather than risk blood and treasure for such a remote territory. Britain, for its part, underestimated Argentina's willingness to use force. While British officials were aware of tensions, many in London believed Buenos Aires would continue to press its claim diplomatically, not militarily. When Argentine forces began moving toward invasion in early 1982, the warnings were missed or dismissed. A crisis ignites. The final spark came from an unlikely incident. In March 1982, a group of Argentine scrap metal workers, accompanied by military personnel, landed on the British-controlled island of South Georgia, part of the wider Falklands dependencies. They raised the Argentine flag. Tensions flared, and a small standoff developed. The junta in Buenos Aires, already preparing for an invasion, took this as the moment to act. By late March, Argentina's military plan, Operation Rosario, was set in motion. The goal was simple: land forces on the Falklands, quickly overwhelm the small British garrison, and secure control of the islands before London could respond. The junta believed international opinion would favor Argentina, framing the takeover as decolonization rather than aggression. In Buenos Aires, crowds filled the streets, chanting patriotic slogans and waving flags. The generals believed they had found their salvation. In London, however, Thatcher and her government were about to surprise them. What Argentina thought would be a swift and bloodless victory was about to trigger one of the most remarkable military campaigns of the late 20th century. Chapter 4: The Invasion, Operation Rosario. In the early hours of April 2, 1982, the silence of the South Atlantic was broken by the sound of engines. Off the coast of East Falkland, shadowy shapes emerged through the darkness, Argentine warships, carrying troops toward the small capital town of Port Stanley. The operation had begun. The plan, codenamed Operation Rosario, was intended to be swift, decisive, and, at least in the minds of Argentina's generals, bloodless. The objective was clear: seize control of the Falkland Islands, overwhelm the tiny British garrison stationed there, and raise the Argentine flag before London had time to react. The British defenders. At this moment, the Falklands were defended by just 68 Royal Marines, supported by a handful of local volunteers. Their commander, Major Mike Norman, knew that an invasion was possible, but the scale of what was about to happen was beyond anything the islanders had imagined. Against them, Argentina was deploying hundreds of elite troops, backed by naval power and armored vehicles. The odds were impossible. Still, the British defenders prepared to resist. Positions were set around Government House, the residence of Governor Rex Hunt. Communication lines buzzed as the alarm spread. Argentine forces were on their way. The islanders, awoken in the middle of the night, could hear the distant rumble of ships and helicopters carrying troops toward the shore. The Argentine landing. At 6 a.m., the first Argentine forces landed at York Bay, just outside Stanley. Amphibious armored vehicles rolled off landing craft, their engines roaring as they splashed through the shallow water and crawled toward the town. At the same time, Argentine commandos were airlifted by helicopters to secure key positions. The operation was carefully planned. The junta wanted control established quickly, but without unnecessary bloodshed that could damage Argentina's international image. As Argentine troops advanced, the British Marines opened fire. In the darkness, bursts of gunfire lit the night sky. Explosions echoed across the bay. The defenders fought bravely, firing from concealed positions, but they were heavily outnumbered. A fierce skirmish broke out near the shore, and casualties began to mount. The fight for Government House. The center of resistance was Government House. Inside, Governor Rex Hunt, dressed defiantly in his ceremonial uniform, stood alongside the Royal Marines. The building was surrounded, gunfire rattling against its walls. Major Norman and his men fought from room to room, holding off the advancing Argentines for hours. The battle was desperate. Marines fired through windows and barricades, while Argentine troops pressed forward. At one point, a group of Argentine commandos attempted to storm the building, only to be driven back by determined fire. Outside, Argentine armored vehicles rumbled through Stanley's streets, intimidating the small local defense force. Surrender. By mid-morning, it was clear the defense could not hold. Outnumbered 10-1, and with no hope of reinforcements, Major Norman realized further resistance would only cost lives. Governor Hunt agreed. Shortly after 9 a.m., the order was given to cease fire. The Royal Marines, their ammunition nearly spent, laid down their weapons. In a symbolic act, the Union Jack was lowered, and the Argentine flag was raised over Stanley. The Malvinas, as Argentina called them, were now in Argentine hands. Governor Hunt and the captured Marines were flown out of the islands to Uruguay, before returning to Britain. Before leaving, Hunt addressed the islanders, urging them to remain calm and assuring them that Britain would not abandon them. Argentina celebrates. News of the invasion electrified Argentina. Crowds flooded the streets of Buenos Aires, waving flags and singing patriotic songs. For the first time in years, the junta enjoyed genuine public support. Newspapers declared the recovery of the Malvinas a national triumph. To many Argentines, it seemed like a historic injustice had finally been corrected. General Galtieri appeared on the balcony of the Casa Rosada, addressing cheering crowds. "We have returned to the Malvinas," he declared. "This time, it is forever." Britain responds. But in London, the reaction was far different. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was informed of the invasion early in the morning. She was furious. "This is a matter of utmost gravity," she told her cabinet. To her, the attack was not only an assault on British territory but a direct challenge to Britain's credibility on the world stage. Within hours, Thatcher's government convened an emergency session. The decision was swift and unanimous. Britain would send a task force to the South Atlantic to retake the islands. What Argentina had expected to be a quick and bloodless victory had, in fact, set in motion one of the largest military operations in British history since World War II. A war begins. On April 3, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 502, calling for an immediate Argentine withdrawal and urging both sides to seek a diplomatic solution. Argentina ignored it. Britain, meanwhile, was already mobilizing. Ships, troops, and aircraft were being readied for the long voyage south. The Falklands War had begun. What started as a bold gamble by Argentina was about to become a test of will, endurance, and military strength. And for the people of the islands, their quiet lives had been shattered, replaced by the grim uncertainty of war. Chapter 5: Britain Strikes Back. The news of Argentina's invasion on April 2, 1982, struck Britain like a thunderclap. A faraway territory, thousands of miles from London, had been seized overnight. For some, it might have seemed an insignificant loss, a remote archipelago in the South Atlantic, home to fewer than 2,000 people. But to Margaret Thatcher and her government, it was something far greater. It was a question of principle. If Britain failed to defend the Falklands, what message would that send, not only to its allies, but to the entire world? Would other overseas territories be next? Would Britain be seen as weak, unable to protect its citizens and uphold international law? For Thatcher, the stakes were not just the Falklands, they were Britain's credibility, honor, and future role in the world. The War Cabinet. On April 2, Thatcher convened an emergency meeting of her War Cabinet. Around the table sat her closest advisors and senior military commanders. The mood was tense but determined. The decision, in the end, was unanimous. Britain would launch a military operation to retake the islands. The scale of what was being proposed was extraordinary. The Falklands lay almost 8,000 miles away. To reach them, a fleet would need to sail across the equator, through the Atlantic, and into the freezing, stormy seas of the South Atlantic. Britain had no permanent military base nearby, no airfields within range, no allies prepared to commit troops. The operation would have to be mounted entirely from the British Isles, sustained over one of the longest supply lines in history. Many doubted it could even be done. But Thatcher was resolute. The Falkland Islands are British territory, she declared. They have been invaded by Argentina. We must recover them. Mobilizing the task force. Within hours, Britain began preparing the largest naval deployment since the Second World War. Warships left their ports in haste, some sailing before their crews had even been fully assembled. Aircraft carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible became the core of the task force. They carried Harrier jump jets, Britain's only chance of providing air cover so far from home. Destroyers and frigates would protect the carriers, while amphibious ships carried troops, vehicles, and supplies. The Royal Fleet Auxiliary, a network of civilian manned support ships, was mobilized to carry fuel, food, and equipment. In an unprecedented move, the government requisitioned civilian vessels, including the luxury ocean liner Queen Elizabeth II, which would transport thousands of troops to the war zone. Dockyards worked around the clock, fitting ships with new equipment, repairing old vessels, and loading vast quantities of supplies. The scale was staggering. By mid-April, more than 100 ships, warships, auxiliaries, and merchant vessels were assembling for the voyage south. Britain was throwing the full weight of its navy into the operation. Public opinion and politics. At home, the invasion had sparked outrage. Newspapers denounced Argentina's act of aggression, and the British public rallied behind the government. For Thatcher, whose popularity had been crumbling amid economic crisis, the Falklands offered both a grave challenge and an opportunity. She became the face of defiance, vowing never to negotiate away the islanders' rights. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some politicians argued that the islands were not worth the risk, that Britain should seek a diplomatic solution rather than launch a costly war. Military experts warned of the dangers: the long supply lines, the unpredictable weather, and the powerful Argentine Air Force, operating from bases just a few hundred miles away. Success was far from guaranteed. But Thatcher refused to back down. "This is not a fight for land," she said. "It is a fight for people, for the right of the Falkland Islanders to remain British if they so choose." Diplomatic maneuvers. Even as the task force set sail, diplomacy continued. The United Nations called for a withdrawal of Argentine forces. The United States, led by President Ronald Reagan, tried to mediate between London and Buenos Aires. Washington was torn between two allies: Britain, a long-standing partner in NATO, and Argentina, a key anti-communist ally in Latin America. Secretary of State Alexander Haig launched what became known as shuttle diplomacy, flying between London and Buenos Aires in an attempt to broker peace. But the gap was unbridgeable. Argentina insisted on sovereignty, Britain demanded withdrawal. Neither side would compromise. By mid-April, it was clear, the crisis would not be resolved at the negotiating table. The fate of the Falklands would be decided on the battlefield. The long voyage. On April 5, the first elements of the British task force sailed from Portsmouth. Families lined the docks, waving Union Jacks and holding back tears as ships slipped into the grey waters of the Channel. Sailors and Marines crowded the decks, uncertain of what awaited them in the far South Atlantic. As the fleet steamed south, it became a symbol of Britain's determination. For the first time in decades, the Royal Navy was preparing for a major war. Across the ocean, in Buenos Aires, Argentina watched with growing unease. The junta had assumed Britain would negotiate or accept defeat. Instead, the British were coming, and they were coming in force. Toward confrontation. By late April, the task force had crossed the equator and was approaching the South Atlantic. Ahead lay freezing seas, hostile skies, and an enemy determined to hold what it had taken. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable military campaigns of the modern era, a clash of navies, aircraft, and soldiers at the ends of the earth. The British were on their way. The countdown to battle had begun. Chapter 6: The War at Sea. The South Atlantic is a vast expanse of water, cold, unpredictable, and unforgiving. For both Britain and Argentina, control of the sea would decide the fate of the Falklands. Whoever commanded the waters could supply, reinforce, and fight for the islands. Whoever lost control would be stranded, their forces isolated and vulnerable. From the moment the British task force sailed, the war at sea became the critical front. The Argentine Navy. Argentina entered the conflict with a formidable navy, the most powerful in South America. It included modern destroyers, submarines, and its pride, the aircraft carrier Era 25 de Mayo. Supported by French-built Exocet missiles and fast attack aircraft, Argentina believed its navy could challenge even the Royal Navy. But the British task force was equally determined. At its core were two aircraft carriers, HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, carrying Harrier jets capable of vertical takeoff and landing. Around them sailed destroyers, frigates, and submarines. Each side prepared for a clash that could decide the war before it even reached the islands. The sinking of the General Belgrano. The first major blow came beneath the waves. On May 2, 1982, the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano, a massive warship originally built for the U.S. Navy during World War II, was patrolling south of the Falklands. Unknown to her crew, a British nuclear-powered submarine, HMS Conqueror, was stalking her silently beneath the sea. At 4 p.m., Conqueror fired 3 torpedoes. 2 struck the cruiser with devastating force. Explosions ripped through the ship's hull, flooding compartments and knocking out power. Within 20 minutes, the Belgrano began to list heavily. Her captain gave the order to abandon ship. Lifeboats and rafts were launched into the freezing waters. Despite desperate rescue efforts, more than 320 Argentine sailors lost their lives. The sinking of the Belgrano sent shockwaves around the world. It was the single deadliest event of the war. In Argentina, grief quickly turned to anger. Crowds gathered outside the British embassy in Buenos Aires, shouting, "Piratas, pirates!" The junta, however, downplayed the loss to maintain morale. But strategically, the impact was immediate. The Argentine Navy pulled its surface fleet back to port, unwilling to risk another devastating submarine strike. From that moment on, the South Atlantic belonged to Britain's submarines. The loss of HMS Sheffield. But Britain would soon feel its own heartbreak. Just 2 days later, on May 4, Argentina struck back with its most feared weapon, the French-made Exocet missile. That afternoon, 2 Argentine Super Étendard jets skimmed low over the sea, evading radar. From 20 miles away, they launched Exocet missiles toward the British destroyer HMS Sheffield. The crew spotted the incoming missiles too late. One Exocet slammed into Sheffield's starboard side. The missile did not explode fully, but its fuel ignited a massive fire. Thick black smoke poured into the sky as sailors fought desperately to contain the blaze. Within hours, it was clear the ship was lost. The order was given to abandon her. 20 sailors were killed in the attack, and the sinking of Sheffield became a sobering moment for Britain. The war was no longer an expedition at sea, it was deadly, and losses would be paid in blood. The image of the burning destroyer, drifting helplessly before slipping beneath the waves, shocked the British public and brought home the true cost of war. The battle for control. For the rest of May, the seas around the Falklands became a deadly arena. Argentine aircraft launched wave after wave of attacks against the British fleet, flying low to avoid radar, skimming just above the waves before releasing bombs and missiles. British ships fought back with anti-aircraft missiles, radar systems, and rapid-fire guns. Some attacks were repelled, but others struck home. Frigates like HMS Ardent, HMS Antelope, and HMS Coventry were lost to Argentine bombs. Each sinking was a tragedy, each ship a reminder that control of the South Atlantic was bought at a terrible price. Argentine pilots displayed extraordinary bravery, pressing attacks at near-suicidal risk, often flying through withering fire to deliver their payloads. Many never returned. Yet despite these losses, the Argentine Navy itself never again ventured far from port. The sinking of the Belgrano had effectively neutralized its surface fleet. The burden of defending the islands shifted to Argentina's Air Force, which fought with determination but faced long flight times and limited refueling capability. The Royal Navy, bloodied but unbroken, maintained its presence. A deadly balance. By the end of May, both sides had suffered painful blows. Britain had lost ships and sailors, Argentina had lost its navy's freedom of action. The sea war had become a contest of endurance. Could the British fleet hold out long enough to land troops and begin the battle on the ground, or could Argentina's air strikes bleed them dry before they reached the shore? The outcome was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: the war at sea had already claimed hundreds of lives and transformed the Falklands conflict into a brutal struggle neither side could easily walk away from. The stage was now set for the next phase of the campaign, the landing of British troops on the islands themselves. The fight for the Falklands was about to move from the seas to the rugged, windswept shores of East Falkland. Chapter 7: The landings at San Carlos Bomb Alley. By mid-May 1982, the British task force had survived the first deadly trials of the war. The seas had become a graveyard for ships, submarines, and sailors, but despite painful losses, the Royal Navy still controlled the South Atlantic. Now came the decisive step: landing troops on the islands themselves. Without soldiers on the ground, Britain could never retake the Falklands. But putting men ashore meant exposing the fleet to Argentina's most dangerous weapon, its air force. It would be a gamble unlike any other in modern British history. Choosing the landing site, military planners studied the islands carefully. The obvious choice, a landing near Port Stanley, was quickly dismissed. The Argentine garrison was heavily dug in around the capital, with artillery, bunkers, and minefields. A direct assault would be suicidal. Instead, British commanders chose San Carlos Water, a sheltered bay on the northwest coast of East Falkland. It was remote, lightly defended, and offered beaches where amphibious ships could unload men and equipment. But the choice came with a deadly risk. San Carlos lay within easy reach of Argentine air bases. Any landing there would turn the narrow waters into a killing ground. Sailors soon gave it a grim nickname, Bomb Alley. The landing begins. On May 21, 1982, under the cover of darkness, the British amphibious ships crept into San Carlos Water. On board were thousands of troops, Royal Marines, the Parachute Regiment, and Gurkhas, along with vehicles, artillery, and supplies. At dawn, landing craft churned toward the beaches, carrying men armed and ready for battle. Surprisingly, the Argentine defenses in the area were weak. Local garrisons offered only scattered resistance. By midday, British troops had established a beachhead, advancing inland and securing high ground. The landings themselves had been almost textbook. But the real danger was about to begin. The Argentine counterattack. As the morning sun rose, Argentine radar operators picked up the invasion fleet. Within hours, waves of attack aircraft were scrambled from the mainland. Skyhawks, daggers, and mirages thundered toward the islands, flying low over the sea to avoid detection. What followed was one of the most intense air-sea battles since World War II. Argentine pilots roared into San Carlos at treetop height, unleashing bombs and cannon fire against the British ships clustered in the narrow waters. Ships fired back with Sea Dart and Sea Wolf missiles, radar-guided guns, and every weapon they had. The sky filled with smoke trails, explosions, and the deafening roar of battle. It was chaos. Argentine bombs struck with terrifying effect. HMS Ardent, a frigate, was hit repeatedly and sank in flames. HMS Antelope was torn apart by unexploded bombs that later detonated while sailors attempted to defuse them. HMS Coventry was bombed and rolled over, sinking in shallow waters. Every attack was a desperate duel between pilots risking their lives and sailors fighting for survival. The British called it Bomb Alley. For a reason, any ship inside San Carlos Water was a target. Courage and sacrifice. The Argentine pilots displayed extraordinary bravery. Flying at near wave-top level, many pressed their attacks through curtains of anti-aircraft fire, knowing the chances of survival were slim. Some dropped bombs so low that the weapons failed to arm properly before impact, bouncing harmlessly off ships' hulls. Others hit their targets but never made it back, shot down by missiles or crashing into the sea. For the British, it was a test of endurance. Crews fought fires, rescued shipmates, and manned guns for hour after hour. Many sailors were killed or wounded. Yet despite the punishment, the Royal Navy held its ground. The amphibious landings continued, supplies were unloaded, and troops poured ashore. By the end of the first week, Britain had suffered the loss of several ships and dozens of lives. But the landing had succeeded. A solid beachhead was established, and thousands of British soldiers were now on Falkland soil, ready to march east toward Stanley. The human cost. The Battle of San Carlos left scars on both sides. The waters were littered with burning ships, wreckage, and oil slicks. Survivors remembered the haunting sight of comrades being pulled from the sea, some alive, others not. Argentine pilots were mourned by their families back home, many of them barely in their 20s, lost in daring missions that tested the limits of courage. For the islanders, the war had arrived on their doorstep. They watched from a distance as the skies erupted with fire and smoke, realizing that their homeland had become a battlefield. A turning point. Despite the heavy losses, San Carlos marked a turning point in the war. Argentina had inflicted damage, but it had failed to stop the landings. Britain had endured the onslaught and established a foothold. Now, with men ashore, the campaign shifted from sea and air to the rugged, frozen landscapes of East Falkland. Ahead lay a brutal ground campaign, long marches across peat bogs, battles fought on windswept hills, and the final push toward Stanley. The war was entering its decisive phase. The Falklands would not be won at sea alone. They would be won on the ground, hill by hill, under the bitter South Atlantic sky. Part 8: Goose Green and the Human Cost. By late May 1982, the South Atlantic was already a graveyard. Ships had been sunk, aircraft had been lost, and hundreds of men on both sides had already paid the ultimate price. But until this moment, the fighting had been largely at sea, or in the air. That was about to change. On the windswept grasslands of East Falkland, the war was about to move to the ground. And in a place called Goose Green, it would claim its first great human cost. Goose Green was a small settlement, little more than a cluster of houses, a community hall, and a tiny airstrip. But for the military commanders, it was a strategic point. To the Argentinians, Goose Green was a forward defense, blocking the British from pushing deeper into East Falkland. To the British task force, it was an obstacle that had to be cleared before advancing toward Port Stanley, the capital. The settlement was held by around 1,000 Argentine troops, including the 12th Infantry Regiment. They were dug in, with trenches, mortars, and heavy machine guns. Though morale was uneven, their defensive positions were strong. Facing them were about 600 men from the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, the legendary 2 Para, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Herbert H. Jones. For the British, this would be the first true land battle of the war. And it would test them in ways they had not yet imagined. The attack begins. At dawn on May 28, 1982, the Paras began their advance. The plan was simple, but dangerous: push forward in darkness, outflank the Argentine defenses, and strike hard. But almost immediately, they faced a grim reality. The terrain around Goose Green was flat, open, and unforgiving. With little cover, every movement exposed the soldiers to enemy fire. Argentine positions opened up with heavy machine guns. Mortar rounds exploded across the grasslands. The men of 2 Para pushed on, crawling through mud, running in short bursts, and throwing themselves into any dip in the ground that offered shelter. The British had support: artillery fire from 105mm guns, naval gunfire from ships offshore, and helicopter supply runs. But much of the fighting was brutally personal, fought with rifles, bayonets, and grenades at close range. Colonel H. Jones. In the chaos, one man stood out: Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones. Known for his fiery leadership and refusal to back down, Jones was frustrated by a stubborn Argentine position that stalled his men's progress. Ignoring the pleas of his officers, he charged forward himself, leading from the front. Under a hail of bullets, Jones advanced, firing his weapon, urging his men to follow. But only moments later, he was struck and fatally wounded. His death shocked the battalion. For a brief moment, confusion spread. What now? Who would lead? But the Paris rallied. Company commanders stepped into the gap, reorganizing their men. Fueled by anger, grief, and determination, the assault pressed on. For his courage that day, Jones was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. His name would become forever linked with Goose Green. The fight intensifies. For hours, the battle raged on. The Paris cleared trench after trench, often fighting face-to-face with Argentine defenders. The sound of machine gun bursts, exploding mortars, and shouted commands filled the air. Soldiers remember the screams of the wounded, the cries for medics, the thud of bodies hitting the ground. By mid-afternoon, both sides were exhausted. Ammunition ran low. Wounded men lay scattered across the fields. Still, the fighting continued. Goose Green had become a battle of endurance, of willpower, of survival. The surrender. Finally, as night fell, the outcome became clear. Surrounded, outnumbered, and without hope of reinforcement, the Argentine defenders began to crumble. By the evening of May 29, the white flags appeared. More than 1,000 Argentine troops surrendered to fewer than 600 British paratroopers. It was an extraordinary result, the first large-scale ground victory for Britain in the Falklands campaign. But the cost was high. 17 British soldiers lay dead, more than 60 wounded. For the Argentines, casualties were far higher, with dozens killed and hundreds injured. Families on both sides would never see their sons again. The human cost. For many veterans, Goose Green marked the moment when the Falklands War became real. No longer was it just ships sinking far out at sea, or aircraft lost in the clouds. This was men killing men, face to face, on cold ground far from home. British survivors recall carrying wounded comrades across open fields under fire, praying they would live. Argentine prisoners remember the shock of defeat, the exhaustion, and the hunger that had haunted them for weeks. And for the islanders of Goose Green, who had lived under occupation, cut off from the world, the liberation was bittersweet. They were free again, but the price had been paid in blood on their very doorstep. Closing narration. Goose Green was more than a victory, it was a lesson. It showed that the British task force could not only land but fight and win on the ground. But it also revealed the terrible truth. Every mile gained in the Falklands would be soaked in sacrifice. For the men of two para, Goose Green was etched into their souls. For Argentina, it was a bitter defeat. And for the world, it was the first glimpse of how cruel this little war could be. Part 9: The Mountain Battles. After Goose Green, the British task force pressed onward. The island's capital, Port Stanley, lay ahead. But between the advancing British and the Argentine stronghold stood a ring of rugged mountains. On these bleak, windswept heights, the war would reach its most brutal and desperate chapter. The battles for Tumbledown, Longdon, Two Sisters, and the surrounding peaks would decide the fate of the Falklands. The strategic ring, Port Stanley, the heart of Argentine control, was shielded by a natural fortress, a line of mountains and ridges that circled the town. To reach the capital, the British had to break through this defensive shield. Each peak was held by Argentine troops, dug in and waiting. For the British, the challenge was enormous. The terrain was treacherous, jagged rocks, steep slopes, freezing temperatures, and long hours of darkness. Any attack would have to be fought uphill, against fortified positions, often in the dead of night. But there was no other choice. Victory required seizing the high ground. Mount Longdon, the Bloody Hill. On the night of June 11, 1982, the 3rd Battalion, Parachute Regiment 3 Para advanced on Mount Longdon. The Argentines of the 7th Infantry Regiment held strong defensive positions, armed with heavy machine guns, mortars, and snipers. As the Paras crept forward under cover of darkness, an Argentine soldier spotted movement and opened fire. Flares lit the sky, and the battlefield was suddenly alive. The Paras were caught in a storm of bullets and shrapnel. What followed was one of the fiercest infantry battles of the entire war. The Paras attacked in waves, advancing yard by yard, throwing grenades into trenches, and engaging in hand-to-hand combat. Bayonets clashed in the darkness. Machine gun fire cut through the night air. The fighting raged for over 10 hours. When dawn broke, Mount Longdon was finally in British hands, but at a terrible cost. 23 British soldiers were killed and more than 40 wounded. Argentine losses were far heavier, with hundreds killed, wounded, or captured. Veterans would later call Mount Longdon the bloodiest hill of the Falklands. Two Sisters and Mount Harriet. At the same time, to the south, Royal Marines from 45 Commando launched an assault on Two Sisters, while 42 Commando attacked Mount Harriet. The battles were equally grueling. Marines advanced silently in the dark, crawling over freezing ground, trying to surprise the defenders. The Argentines, though cold and exhausted, fought fiercely. Mortar shells and machine gun bursts tore through the night. The Marines pressed forward, supported by artillery and naval bombardments from offshore ships. Slowly, methodically, they cleared trench after trench, forcing the Argentines back. By dawn, both mountains were captured. The battle for Mount Tumbledown. But the fiercest of all came on June 13th, at Mount Tumbledown. This peak was the key to Stanley itself, and it was defended by some of Argentina's best troops, the 5th Marine Infantry Battalion, well-trained and determined. The assault fell to the Scots Guards, supported by the Gurkhas and the Welsh Guards. As night fell, they moved forward in silence. Suddenly, the mountain erupted in fire. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery hammered the advancing guardsmen. The battle devolved into chaos, close quarters fighting among the rocks and trenches, often just meters apart. The Scots Guards fought with extraordinary courage, pressing forward despite mounting casualties. Bayonet charges were launched against Argentine positions. The Gurkhas, feared for their ferocity, advanced relentlessly, unnerving the defenders. After nearly 8 hours of savage combat, Mount Tumbledown was finally secured. The Argentine defenders withdrew, leaving the path to Stanley open. But the price was high. The Scots Guards lost 8 men killed and dozens wounded. The Argentines, too, suffered heavily. The final push. By the morning of June 14th, the ring of mountains around Port Stanley had been broken. The British controlled Longdon, Two Sisters, Harriet, and Tumbledown. The Argentine defense line had collapsed. Their soldiers, cold, hungry, and exhausted, had fought bravely, but the relentless British assaults had proven too much. The fall of the mountains meant only one thing: Stanley itself was now exposed. The capital of the Falklands lay within reach. Human cost and soldiers' memories. For the men who fought in the mountain battles, the memories never faded. Veterans speak of the freezing cold, the smell of cordite and blood, the cries of the wounded echoing through the night. British survivors recall advancing over ground littered with rocks and bodies, the eerie glow of flares lighting the hills, and the constant fear of snipers hidden in the darkness. Argentine veterans remember the feeling of being outnumbered, overwhelmed, yet determined to resist until the very end. These battles were not just military operations. They were personal struggles for survival, fought man to man, often within arm's reach of the enemy. Closing narration. In the black nights of June 1982, on the ridges that guarded Stanley, the Falklands War reached its peak of brutality. Men fought with bayonets, grenades, and bare courage, in battles as savage as any of the 20th century. The mountains of Longdon, Harriet, Two Sisters, and Tumbledown became names carved into history. By their capture, the war's end was in sight. The ring had been broken. Stanley lay open, and the final act of the Falklands War was about to begin. Part 10: The Fall of Port Stanley, Argentina's Surrender. By mid-June 1982, the outcome of the Falklands War hung in the balance. The British task force had fought its way across treacherous terrain, capturing mountain after mountain in bitter night battles. Now, the path to Port Stanley, the capital of the islands and the heart of Argentine occupation, lay open. The final act was about to begin. The encirclement of Stanley. After the fall of Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Harriet, and Tumbledown, the Argentine defensive ring was shattered. The British now occupied the high ground surrounding Stanley. From their new positions, they could look down on the town itself, nestled along the coast. Argentine troops inside Stanley numbered nearly 10,000 men, but they were exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized. Many were young conscripts, poorly trained and ill-prepared for the relentless British advance. They had endured weeks of freezing cold, hunger, and constant bombardment. Ammunition was running low, morale was collapsing. The British, by contrast, though tired and bloodied, now held the initiative. Reinforcements, supplies, and artillery had been brought forward. The Royal Navy continued to shell Argentine positions, and British aircraft flew overhead, striking at defensive strongpoints. It was clear, the war was reaching its decisive moment. The push into Stanley. On the night of June 13 into June 14, British units began moving closer to Stanley. The Gurkhas, feared across the world for their discipline and ferocity, advanced silently toward the outskirts. Other units, including the 2nd and 3rd Parachute Regiments, prepared for a final assault. But the Argentines, seeing the overwhelming strength arrayed against them, knew the end was near. Defenders abandoned positions, retreating into the town. Civilians, who had endured weeks of occupation, huddled in basements and shelters, praying the battle would soon be over. By the early morning of June 14, British forces were within striking distance of Stanley itself. Artillery shells rained down on Argentine positions. Machine gun fire echoed across the ridges. The British commanders, however, sought to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. They knew victory was inevitable, but they did not want Stanley reduced to rubble in the process. General Menendez's decision. Inside Stanley, General Mario Menendez, the Argentine commander, faced a grim choice. His troops were exhausted, their positions hopeless, their capital surrounded. Continuing the fight would mean the destruction of his army, and the slaughter of civilians in the town. That morning, Menendez met with his senior officers. Reports from the front were dire. British units were closing in from every direction. Ammunition was nearly gone. Communications were breaking down. At 9:30 a.m., Menendez requested a ceasefire. A white flag was raised over Stanley. The war, it seemed, was over. The formal surrender. In the afternoon of June 14, 1982, General Menendez surrendered formally to Major General Jeremy Moore, commander of the British ground forces. The ceremony was simple, quiet, almost anticlimactic. There were no grand speeches, just signatures on paper and the acknowledgement of defeat. Around 10,000 Argentine soldiers laid down their arms. The scale of the surrender was staggering. The British task force, numbering only about 7,000 combat troops, had overcome a far larger army through discipline, training, and determination. As the Union Jack was raised once more over Port Stanley, cheers erupted from the liberated islanders. After 74 days of occupation, the Falklands were free again. Civilians emerged from their homes, waving flags, embracing British soldiers, and celebrating the end of their ordeal. Scenes of victory and defeat. For the British, the moment was one of triumph. Soldiers who had marched across mountains and fought through nights of terror now stood in the streets of Stanley, weary but victorious. Some wept openly, others quietly smoked cigarettes, staring at the town they had fought so hard to reach. For the Argentines, it was a moment of heartbreak. Soldiers, many just teenagers, were rounded up, disarmed, and taken into captivity. They were exhausted, hungry, and humiliated. Some wept, not only for their defeat but for the friends they had lost along the way. In Buenos Aires, news of the surrender shocked the nation. Crowds gathered, first in disbelief, then in anger. The junta that had promised glory had delivered only defeat. The end of the war. The Falklands War was over. After 74 days of fighting, Britain had retaken the islands. The final toll was heavy. 649 Argentines killed, 255 British dead, and 3 islanders caught in the crossfire. Thousands more were wounded, scarred for life, both physically and emotionally. But in Port Stanley, on that cold June day, there was only one feeling: relief. For the soldiers, the civilians, and the commanders on both sides, the guns finally fell silent. Closing narration. On June 14, 1982, as the Union Jack rose once more over Port Stanley, the Falklands War came to its end. A small war, fought in a remote corner of the globe, but one that cost dearly in lives, in blood, in grief. For Britain, it was a moment of victory and vindication. For Argentina, a moment of sorrow and shame. And for the people of the Falklands, it was liberation, bought at a terrible price. Part 11. The World Watches. International Diplomacy and Reactions. As British and Argentine soldiers fought across the frozen hills of the South Atlantic, the world watched with a mixture of fascination, concern, and disbelief. For a war so far from the centers of power, the Falklands conflict carried consequences that reached into capitals across the globe. Diplomats scrambled, alliances were tested, and nations were forced to choose: support Britain, support Argentina, or remain silent. The United Nations. From the beginning, the United Nations was thrust into the heart of the crisis. On April 3, 1982, the day after Argentina invaded, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 502, demanding an immediate withdrawal of Argentine forces and a negotiated settlement. Britain welcomed the resolution, but Argentina rejected it. Throughout the war, the UN continued to call for ceasefires, urging both sides to halt the fighting. Yet in practice, these appeals fell on deaf ears. Britain, determined to retake the islands, was unwilling to pause while its troops advanced. Argentina, equally determined to hold on to its prize, ignored the resolutions. For the UN, the war was a sobering reminder of its limited power when major states refused to compromise. The United States, torn between allies. Perhaps the most delicate diplomatic position was that of the United States. On one hand, Argentina was a regional ally in Latin America, part of Washington's broader strategy during the Cold War. On the other, Britain was America's closest partner, bound by history, culture, and the NATO alliance. At first, President Ronald Reagan sought mediation. His Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, shuttled between London and Buenos Aires, attempting to broker a peaceful settlement. But as weeks passed, and as Argentine forces refused to withdraw, American patience ran out. By May, the United States tilted decisively toward Britain. Washington provided intelligence from satellites, logistical support, and critical supplies, including the air-to-air missiles that helped British pilots counter Argentine aircraft. American diplomacy had failed, but the special relationship with Britain had endured. For Argentina, this was a bitter betrayal. Latin America, divided loyalties. Across Latin America, the war stirred deep emotions. For many countries, Argentina's claim to the islands, known throughout the region as the Islas Malvinas, was seen as legitimate, a stand against lingering colonialism. Nations such as Peru, Brazil, and Venezuela expressed open sympathy for Argentina. Yet not all of South America stood united. Chile, under General Augusto Pinochet, quietly provided assistance to Britain. Chile's leaders feared Argentine expansionism and saw an opportunity to weaken a rival. Chilean radar stations tracked Argentine aircraft, passing information to the British task force. Chilean airbases even served as emergency landing sites for British aircraft. This secret cooperation was a reminder that even within Latin America, old rivalries outweighed continental solidarity. The Soviet Union and the Cold War lens. The Soviet Union and its allies viewed the Falklands conflict through the prism of the Cold War. To Moscow, the war was a struggle between imperial powers, far removed from socialist ideals. Soviet intelligence closely monitored the fighting, particularly Britain's use of advanced weapons and naval strategy. While the USSR provided no direct assistance to Argentina, propaganda outlets condemned Britain's actions as colonialist aggression. For the Soviets, the Falklands War was not about territory, it was about ideology, and the chance to criticize the West. Europe and NATO. Among Britain's NATO allies in Europe, the reaction was supportive but cautious. France, whose Exocet missiles had already caused devastation to British ships, quietly assisted London by sharing technical information on how to counter their own weapon. West Germany and other NATO members offered political support, but little else. In Europe, the war was seen as a curious echo of the past, an imperial-style conflict in an age when such wars were thought to be gone. Yet Britain's resolve impressed many, proving that London was still willing to project power far from home. Media and public opinion. Beyond the halls of power, the war captured the world's imagination. Newspapers, television, and radio carried daily updates. Images of burning ships, soldiers trudging across icy landscapes, and grieving families appeared on front pages worldwide. In Britain, the war was followed with a mixture of anxiety and pride. The sinking of HMS Sheffield shocked the nation, while the recapture of Goose Green and the fall of Stanley brought jubilation. Across Argentina, state-controlled media painted the conflict as a noble fight for sovereignty, but as defeats mounted, the tone shifted from triumph to despair. Elsewhere, the public was divided. Some saw Britain's campaign as a justified defense of self-determination for the islanders. Others criticized both nations for spilling blood over remote rocks in the South Atlantic. Closing narration. The Falklands War was never just about two nations, it was a drama played out before the entire world. From Washington to Moscow, from Santiago to Brussels, governments weighed their words carefully, aware that every move was being watched. Some offered help, others offered sympathy, many simply looked on in shock. And when the war ended, the world was left with questions: what had been gained, what had been lost, and what lessons would endure. Part 12: Aftermath. Political consequences in both countries. The guns finally fell silent over the windswept terrain of the Falklands on June 14, 1982. But in many ways, the war was just beginning to shape the destinies of both Argentina and the United Kingdom. The aftermath of the conflict carried profound political consequences, altering governments, national identities, and the relationship between the two countries for decades to come. Argentina. The collapse of the junta. For Argentina, the war was nothing short of catastrophic. The ruling military junta, which had launched the invasion in a desperate attempt to rally nationalist sentiment and distract from domestic failures, found itself humiliated. Defeat exposed not only their military weakness but also their incompetence in leadership. The loss of over 600 Argentine servicemen, combined with the economic burden of war and the clear evidence of mismanagement, eroded public support. Within a year, mass protests filled the streets of Buenos Aires. The generals, once feared, became targets of ridicule and anger. By 1983, the junta collapsed entirely. Argentina returned to democracy under Raúl Alfonsín, marking the end of one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history. The Falklands defeat thus became a catalyst for Argentina's democratic rebirth, even though the loss left a deep wound in its national psyche. Britain, a triumph for Thatcher. In Britain, the political consequences were the mirror opposite. For Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Falklands conflict transformed her fortunes. Before the war, her government was deeply unpopular, struggling with recession, unemployment, and social unrest. Many believed she would not survive the next election. But victory in the South Atlantic changed everything. The swift, decisive success restored national pride in a country that had been perceived as declining on the world stage. The press hailed her as the Iron Lady, a leader who had shown strength and resolve. Her approval ratings skyrocketed, and in 1983 she won a landslide election victory. The Falklands War cemented Thatcher's authority at home and bolstered Britain's global standing, signaling that the United Kingdom, though no longer an empire, was still a force to be reckoned with. A widening divide. Despite their divergent outcomes, both countries were left with a new tension between them. Argentina's new democratic government maintained the claim over the Malvinas, refusing to abandon the issue despite its defeat. Britain, emboldened by victory, invested heavily in the island's defense and infrastructure, determined never again to risk their loss. Thus, the political aftermath ensured that while the fighting had ended, the dispute over sovereignty would remain alive. The war had redrawn political landscapes in both capitals, toppling a dictatorship on one side of the Atlantic, and securing a political dynasty on the other. Part 13: Legacy, Veterans, Memory, and the Falklands today. The Falklands War lasted only 10 weeks, but its legacy has endured for over 4 decades. Beyond the military victory and political consequences, the conflict left behind scars, both visible and invisible, for veterans, families, and entire nations. The memory of 1982 continues to shape identity, politics, and life on the islands themselves. The human toll. For the men who fought, the war never truly ended. Over 900 lives were lost, more than 600 Argentines and 255 Britons. Thousands more carried wounds that could not be seen. Soldiers who had endured freezing nights, relentless shelling, and brutal close combat often returned home struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. In Argentina, many veterans felt forgotten, even betrayed, by their government. Promises of recognition and care often went unfulfilled, leading to decades of protest and advocacy. Alarmingly, the number of Argentine veterans who later took their own lives has been estimated to rival the number who died in combat. In Britain, veterans were generally honored, but many still felt the psychological burden of their experiences. Organizations and memorials were created to support them, and the war remains a central part of Britain's modern military identity. Memory and commemoration. Every year, ceremonies of remembrance take place in both nations. In Britain, the 14th of June, Liberation Day, is marked with solemn commemorations, especially in the Falklands, where the local population expresses gratitude to those who fought for their freedom. In Argentina, the 2nd of April, the date of the invasion, is known as the Día del Veterano y de los Caídos en la Guerra de Malvinas, Day of the Veteran and the Fallen in the Malvinas War. It is a day of mourning, reflection, and national unity, even as the war remains a symbol of a painful chapter. The Islanders. For the people of the Falklands themselves, the war was a turning point. Before 1982, life on the islands was isolated, with little investment or attention from Britain. After the war, London poured resources into the territory, building an airfield, improving infrastructure, and ensuring military protection. The population, overwhelmingly English-speaking and culturally British, grew more confident in their identity. In a 2013 referendum, nearly 99% voted to remain under British sovereignty, sending a clear message to Argentina and the world. They saw their future as part of the United Kingdom. The dispute that never died. Despite the passage of time, Argentina has never abandoned its claim to the islands, and Britain has never shown willingness to compromise sovereignty. Diplomatic tensions flare periodically, though open conflict has not returned. Oil exploration, fishing rights, and geopolitical alliances continue to fuel the debate. A lasting legacy. The Falklands War remains one of the last conventional wars fought between two modern nations. It was a clash of 20th-century technology, old-fashioned infantry combat, and immense human endurance. Its legacy is one of pride and pain, victory and loss, remembered differently depending on which side of the Atlantic one stands. For veterans, the war is not just history, it is part of their identity. For the Islanders, it was the defining moment of their modern existence. For both Britain and Argentina, it remains a lesson in the costs of nationalism, leadership, and war itself. Part 14 Epilogue. Closing Reflections. The Falklands War of 1982 was short in duration but vast in consequence. It was a conflict fought on the edge of the world, yet it captured the attention of millions. Its story is not just about military operations or territorial claims, it is about people, choices, and the enduring shadow of war. The nature of the war. Unlike many modern conflicts, the Falklands War was conventional. It was fought with ships, aircraft, and infantry, in harsh environments that tested endurance as much as courage. Battles like Goose Green, Mount Tumbledown, and Mount Longdon showed that despite advanced technology, war often comes down to men on the ground, fighting with grit, bayonets, and determination. It also showed the limits of military power. Argentina's occupation began with confidence but ended in disaster. Britain's task force succeeded, but at significant cost, reminding the world that even victories carry heavy burdens. The human dimension. Behind every headline were stories of young men, many barely out of school, who suddenly found themselves in life or death struggles thousands of miles from home. Some returned as heroes, others as casualties, and many more bore invisible wounds that never fully healed. Families in both Argentina and Britain endured heartbreak that no treaty or political gain could ever justify. The islanders themselves, once living quietly and somewhat forgotten by the outside world, found their fate thrust into the center of international politics. Their resilience through occupation and liberation became part of the war's lasting symbol. A war watched by the world. The conflict unfolded in a global spotlight. For Britain, it restored a sense of pride and determination, reinforcing its role on the world stage. For Argentina, it marked the beginning of the end of military dictatorship and the return of democracy. For the international community, it was a reminder that even in the late 20th century, disputes over land and sovereignty could still ignite war. Lessons and legacy. The Falklands War left behind lessons about leadership, logistics, diplomacy, and human sacrifice. It proved that war can still erupt unexpectedly, that distant territories still matter, and that ordinary people, soldiers and civilians alike, carry the weight of history on their shoulders. For the world, the Falklands remains a symbol of national pride, of contested identity, and of the price of war. For veterans and islanders, it is not just a story from the past, it is lived memory, shaping lives even decades later. Final reflection. The Falklands War reminds us that history is never far away. In the cold winds that sweep across the South Atlantic, in the graves of the fallen, and in the memories of those who lived through it, the war still whispers its lessons. It is a story of courage and loss, of nations and individuals, of decisions that change the course of lives. And it stands as a reminder that, while wars may end, their echoes carry on, shaping generations yet to come.